Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here on your 100th anniversary, and I congratulate you most warmly for that. It's actually a little bit intimidating to be the last speaker in your 100th year. However, I'll cope. I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we have been doing in the Niagara region on 12 Mile Creek. It's our baby. Trout Unlimited is a conservation organization. I have to emphasize that because everybody thinks that when I say Trout Unlimited that we're a fishing club. And we're trying to work very hard to live that down. There's actually been talk about changing the name. However, we are not a fishing club. We are a conservation organization dedicated to the preservation and conservation, the protection and restoration of freshwater ecosystems across Canada. The fact is, to be honest, many of us do fly fish. I would guess that in our particular chapter, the Niagara chapter, probably a little bit fewer than half are fly anglers. And those people, if you question them, will tell you that they have joined Trout Unlimited as a way of giving back to an activity that they have enjoyed and loved. The majority of people in our chapter are not anglers, but are dedicated conservationists who recognize the value of preserving cold, fresh water. Other chapters, the proportions will be somewhat different. The national organization is based in Calgary, but we have a very large office in Guelph that serves our needs as well. PUC has been around for 40 years and a little bit more, and is science-based, and I think that's worth noting, volunteer-driven, and more work has been done on cold water conservation by Trout Unlimited than any other group. The national office, I don't know how they calculate this, but the national office tells us that for every dollar donated, we put $4 into the environment. Okay, that's the advertising. Why Trout Unlimited? Why not Bass Unlimited? I was asked that by a group of Boy Scouts one time. Why not Bass Unlimited? We like bass. Trout are an indicator species. Where trout exist, the water is cold, clear, and unpolluted. So they're the best indicator we have of success in restoring cold water. If there are trout living there, or if we can introduce trout that survive there, then we've done our job. There are 3 varieties of trout in our streams. 2 of them are invasive, in quotes. Rainbow trout were introduced from the West Coast many, many years ago by anglers who wanted sport. Brown trout, the same, introduced originally from Germany for the same purpose, sport, and are much hardier than our native brook trout. Also, you may be familiar with them called speckled trout. They are actually not a trout at all. They're a char. But for the sake of convenience, we lump them in with the trout because they're so similar. The other native trout to our waters is the lake trout. But I don't mention it because it lives in lakes and we're concerned with streams. Brook trout are the most fragile of the trout species. They die at 22 degrees. They suffer at 20. They reproduce at anything under 17. So that gives you an indicator of how important cold water is to this species and what a good indicator they are of our success in restoring streams. That's what they look like. The indicator, there are 2 indicators that you can always rely on with brook trout if you see trout in the water. The blue halo on the red spots is one. The other is the white edge on the fins. If you see those, then you're looking at a brook trout. And if you go to the Short Hills Sanctuary, you'll see one of the last remaining spots on 12 Mile Creek that still has those guys. Which is why this is such a nice thing for me to be doing with you people, because your nature sanctuary is vitally important to our work. And let me just orient you a little bit. This is 12 Mile Creek, or at least the upper 12 Mile Creek. 12 Mile Creek you may be familiar with as you drive down the Queenie, is that great big river that runs through Port Dalhousie. You cross over it when you go into St. Catharines. That's 12 Mile Creek. But it's a different stream than what we're concerned with. And I'll explain why. But the one that we're concerned with is this green area here. I like to say it looks like lungs, and that's very appropriate. It is the lungs of the Niagara region. This is Font Hill, and that's St. Catharines. Okay, so you get a little bit oriented. Lake Ontario is up there. And that gives you a different look at it. The two branches that we're most concerned with are the Effingham branch and the St. John's branch. Terrace Creek branch and Swayze Creek branch are both seasonal. They run dry in the summer. So they're important tributaries in a sense, but of little importance to us in preserving cold water environments. Camp Wetaskiwin is the little, is this thing going to work? No. The little square in the middle there, in the green, it's a Boy Scout camp. The green around that is Short Hills Provincial Park. So that kind of gets you oriented a little bit. This is of much more importance to you. The Short Hills Nature Sanctuary is right there. So it's that square right there is the Short Hills Nature Sanctuary. This is the source right here of the Effingham branch of the 12 Mile Creek, one of the two important branches, Effingham and St. John's. So the source is right there. The creek flows this way onto your property and then flows through it down to, crosses Effingham up that way, goes that way. Okay, so this is, given that this is the source of one of the main branches of 12 Mile Creek, you can get some sense of the importance of the land that you own. So again, there's the creek, the bigger sense. I just want to point out what happens to the creek where this water here enters into it. This water here is the Welland Canal. And the Welland Canal not only carries ships back and forth Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, it also supplies St. Catharines with its water and provides the power for the DeCue Power Station, the Ontario Power Generation Power Station, which is right where this water enters 12 Mile Creek up there. So from that point on, just as it enters St. Catharines, 90% of the water that flows through that channel is from Lake Erie, direct from Lake Erie via the Welland Canal, 90% of it. So what we're concerned about in Trout Unlimited is the 10% that is spring-fed cold water. Once it hits the DeCue generating station, then it becomes something else again. It's a different stream. It's a different water system. That's the generating system, or generating station. The water comes from Lake Erie here and enters 12 Mile Creek and is 90% of the water that flows from there down to Port Dalhousie, the Henley Regatta area, the Port Dalhousie Dam, and that's what enters Lake Ontario. So once again, we're back here. The headwaters right here, nature sanctuary right there, Short Hills Nature Sanctuary. And I want to talk about a couple of the projects that we have undertaken to make 12 Mile Creek better. Right in the headwaters, where I pointed out the source of 12 Mile Creek's Effingham Branch is, there are 3 man-made ponds. Those ponds are formed by damming up the creek. That would not be allowed today, but back 60 years ago, nobody particularly cared. So they dammed up the ponds for the only reason that they like the look of having a pond on their property. The problem with those ponds, as you might guess, is that the ponds are warmed by the sun. Strikes the surface. The surface water then flows over an overflow down to the next pond where it's warmed again, flows over an overflow into the next pond where it's warmed again, and then flows into the Short Hills Nature Sanctuary across Metler Road. So what you're getting on your property is probably about 10 degrees at least warmer than the source water that comes in. The source water that comes in normally comes in bubbling out of the ground at 11 or 12 degrees year-round. What you're getting coming into across Metler is somewhere around 22, depending on the time of year, because of course the ponds are affected by the temperature. Our solution to this very serious problem was to create a bottom draw system for those dams. We went to the landowners and said, how about we take your ponds away? No. So then we said, all right, we'll leave your ponds, but how about we take the cold water off the bottom of the ponds and send that downstream instead of the warmed surface water that's now going downstream. And they said, what's it going to cost me? And we finally were able to say nothing. We're able to do it. And believe it or not, they agreed. Challenges, getting the landowners' permission. These landowners recognized the liability that they had with those dams. They understood that if those dams failed, that they were liable for all of the damage that the water would cause as it goes downstream, and they were petrified of having somebody in a uniform come onto their property and either fine them or force them to do something or cost them thousands of dollars. And they had ordered people off the property from the ministry and from the Conservation Authority. Told them, you can't come on my property. Some guys come along who are volunteers, fishermen, local yokels, and say, we got some money, we can improve your property, and we were able to get their approval. The NPCA, the Conservation Authority, had been trying to get this exact task done for more than 30 years. Here are the ponds. This is the first one here, the second one there, and the third one you could see up there. There's Metler Road and your property. There's the way that the ponds were overflowing before we got started. So they created a box of concrete block, and the warm surface water falls into that box and goes down to the next pond, down to the next pond and down into the 12 Mile Creek. You can see that these are not in very good shape, which is another reason that the landowners were happy to come and have us pay to have them fixed. This was the design that the engineers gave us, so our schematic of what we were going to build is this. So we have the box, but instead of the water just flowing into the top of the box, it comes from a pipe that's inserted down into the lower, cooler water. And so we began construction. It was a big job, as you can see. Jen was talking about the importance of having good equipment. We were very lucky to have a major excavation company come in. And this is the new box that we developed. And that's what it looked like before we put the water back in the pond. And that's what it looked like when the water went back in. And that's what it looks like today. Doesn't look much different from what it did, except that the water flowing downstream is about 8 or 9 degrees cooler. It's not, to be honest with you, it didn't do as much as we had hoped. 8 or 9 degrees, great. Brook trout still can't survive in it. Our second major project that we undertook last year was a major problem in 12 Mile Creek. Erosion is a terrific problem. The creek runs through silty, sandy soil for a lot of the way that it goes down, and that is subject to erosion. Whenever we get a flooding event, whenever we get a lot of water racing down, the erosion is terrific. And the erosion is getting worse because the flooding events are getting worse. Why are they getting worse? 2 reasons mostly. Global warming and the increasingly violent rainstorms and storms that we get. But more importantly than that is development in the Font Hill area, which, as you saw, is right in the headwaters of 12 Mile Creek. And that development results in roadways, rooftops, driveways, all impermeable. The water can't get through. And what was once a field that allowed the water to soak through and become part of the groundwater, now that water is just streaming off all of those impermeable surfaces and creating these flooding events. So there are those 2 factors that are causing the erosion to be worse than it ever has been before. The sedimentation in the sandy soils leads to shallow water that, and the stream channel is widened and becomes shallow. And again, that leads to warming. Our solution, construct what are called wing deflectors in the trade to create meanders. So we're going to, instead of having this wide, shallow stream, we're going to create a more, it sounds weird, to create a more natural stream channel by making the stream meander, narrowing it, and letting it channel in instead of cutting the banks. So that was the idea. Boy, do we have problems with permits. Everybody agrees. We go to the MNRF, we go to the NPCA, we go to the Escarpment Commission. All of these folks say, great idea, wonderful. But you still got to get the permit, and that'll take you 2 years. So we've been wrestling with that. We've developed a pretty good relationship with the NPCA of late. They've gone through their problems, and they seem to be, those problems seem to be behind them. Gone? Gone. No? There. Seem to be behind them, and we're developing a very good relationship with them. We're actually signing next week a memorandum of understanding between our 2 organizations to work on 12 Mile Creek. So we're getting there with them. We also have a pretty good relationship with the MNRF, but it doesn't matter. They still need to go through the permitting process, and that drives us crazy. Getting machinery to the site with as little impact as possible was also a big problem on this one because we were in the actual headwaters. However, as you can see, we did get the machinery in. The operator was absolutely brilliant, just a tremendous guy. He gets it. Not everybody does, but when he came on site, he said, okay, explain to me what you're doing. Why are you doing it? He said, well, we're trying to restore a natural environment and get aquatic species living here and a better environment for other species and so on. And he clearly got it. And the real example of that was when he was moving his excavator, and all of a sudden, he's carrying a great big log, and all of a sudden he stops, gets out of the cab, and goes around and moves a toad. This is a contractor, you know. So we knew he got it. This is what we were trying to do. We were using ash trees that were already dead, although that one's a cedar, but we used mostly ash trees that were already dead or dying, and inserted them into the banks 2/3 of the way on land and 1/3 out into the stream to create a wedge, and then filled the wedge in and then planted all of that. So the idea was, again, create meanders, narrow the stream, and let it channel and deepen itself. And that's what it looked like last summer after the work had been done and the plants had started to grow up. So the stream is much healthier. It's not a fix. It's not a fix. It's a Band-Aid, but at least it's a start. It's getting us somewhere where we can be proud of the progress that we've made. Our third major project was also last year, where there's a huge high bank on 12 Mile Creek of basically a cliff, a clay cliff. And any time that it rained, the clay gets swept into the creek. And of course, the stream below gets all that sediment. Our solution, we staked down mats of biodegradable material called core mats made of coconut fiber that eventually dissolves. And we installed fascines, I'll show you a picture, bundles of live plant material into the face of the cliff so that the roots would take and help hold the clay. I'm told by people who know much better than I do that if properly installed, root wads, root masses have more strength than tensile steel at holding dirt together. And so that was another thing that we did. And then we planted native species, flowers and plants and shrubs all across the face of the cliff in the hopes that all of that would stabilize it. The big challenge was finding volunteers who wanted to do this stuff. Pretty tough. The other challenge that we had is that Short Hills Park, which is where we were doing this particular project, is well populated with white-tailed deer. The ministry tells us that there are 500 in there from aerial surveys, and they say, according to their surveys, that the park can support a healthy population of 80. However, so they eat everything. They eat everything. They have taken to eating plants that previously were immune to deer, that deer didn't like. So you plant these things thinking that you were safe and that you could get the ground with the root system in, but the deer would eat even those. The only thing we can plant that the deer won't eat are hawthorn and rose because of all the sticks in them. So there's the cliff. There's the creek running down below, and you can see any rain event will drive clay into the cliff, or down the cliff into the stream. That gives you a perspective of what we were working on, the steepness of it. And here they are installing the fascines, these bundles of live plants dug into the face of the cliff that will, when you cover them up, and then the next year, they will sprout and create a barrier for erosion. Then we started spreading these core mats down the face of the cliff and staked them down so that they'd stay in place. Planted some shrubs and bushes into them. It's our intrepid crew. And there you can see the creek down below, the core matting, and that's what it looks like in the summer. So it looks like it's working. It looks like we've been able to make a difference. That's another view of how it looked in the summertime. So it has been a hopeful project. We're still hoping that it will stabilize that cliff enough. Our fourth major project, and the last one I really wanted to talk about, we've got in 12 Mile Creek, because of the erosion, because of the storm events and so on, we've got a lot of banks that are extremely unstable. And the flooding has channelized the stream, causing even more erosion. Our solution is in two parts. The first part was to create cross veins to narrow the flow and make a riffle. So a healthy stream has riffles and pools. So you have these little riffly parts, like rapids, if you like, and then a pool, and then another riffle, and then another pool. So we created an artificial riffle using wood that we put in a V, and then another piece across the V, and put a notch in the cross piece. And the water channels into that and creates a riffle. And we installed, there we go again, there we are. We installed crib walls to stabilize the banks. Now these are live crib walls so that they look like they're just logs, like a log barrier, log wall, but they are seeded and planted with live shrubs so that they will eventually become a live wall. Permits, environmental assessments, our usual challenges, and this was a costly one. This is the before and after. This is the stream where the bank is unstable and will continue to widen and become shallower. This is the final bank stabilization on at least on one spot. We did it in two different spots. So there's the stream. One of those crib walls was here, another one up there, and you can see where the cross veins were installed as well. So that was the idea. And there's some of the progress as we were going. You can see the cross veins and the notched log there quite easily. And here, and the guys at work. We also put in a lot of river stone, which eventually, as the stream settles, will become spawning ground for trout. Within 2 weeks, this notch and the cross veins, the notch, had dug a nice little pool in there, and it will continue to do so. And within 2 weeks, there were fish living in that pool. So it doesn't take long once the stream is more friendly. And there it is there. This is the current project. It's called Healthy 12 Mile Creek. And we've been very fortunate in being funded for this very well. And we've been doubly fortunate in being able to hire a manager to run it for us. Instead of relying on volunteer time, and all of you who are involved in volunteer activity know how volunteer activity can expand to fill all available time. And our volunteers will quickly burn out if they're asked to do this kind of major project. So, lucky us, we hired Megan at the back in black, and Megan Lally has become our manager. And if you want to go back and meet Megan later on, you'll see why she's been so good, because she is a people person. And she has all kinds of great literature there for you if you want to go back and visit her later. So the Healthy 12 Mile Creek project, 80% of the land along the 12 Mile Creek is owned by private landowners. We cannot do anything to save the creek without the participation of landowners. So we formed this Healthy 12 Mile Creek, funded by the Trillium Foundation and the Greenbelt Foundation, to outreach to landowners and work with them to become better stewards of their own land, of their own creek. Part of the mandate that we have is educating them and others, planting both riparian, that is along the edge of the stream, and general reforestation of the entire headwaters. Those are two more of our mandates. And then eventually we're going to get down to in-stream erosion control, such as the projects that I've just shown you. Those were done before this project came on stream. Where there are farmers, and there are a number along the creek, we will look at livestock control, both keeping them out of the stream and keeping their manure out of the stream. Trillium Seed Grant. Seed grant means that they give you some money to see if you can do what you said you'd do. So it's planting the seeds. It's finding out if you have the wherewithal and the resources and the people who can do what you said you'd do and what they agreed to fund. So they said, find 3 properties, see if you can get 3 landowners on side. Launch with lots of publicity and get the media involved. And then, if you're successful and you report back to us and you've done what you said you would do for the seed grant, we'll give you a grow grant, which is significant money. And that is where we'll start doing the in-stream work, such as the projects that I've shown you. So the work under Megan's direction began, and given that the timelines that we had and the limited resources, we were only able really to do plantings. And you're familiar with planting. So we were doing riparian planting, that is planting along the edge of the stream. The riparian zone is sort of like the first 15 or 20 feet beside the stream. And scouts were involved, our volunteers were involved. Megan coerced people from all over the place to come and get involved, and we had 90 volunteers come out at our various plantings to restore the edges of the creek. We said we'd reach out to 3 landowners. We say we'd get 3 landowners involved. What are we at now, Megan? How many landowners? About 30. We have about 30 who we have contacted and have agreed to work with us. So if we don't get that GROW grant, we're going to be... Okay, this is the Moor. That was the 12-mile creek. This is the Moor. Some of the other things that we do as a group you might be interested in. One of them, one of the really interesting projects that we've taken on is the Healing Waters program. The Healing Waters program is enormous in the United States. They have a lot more injured soldiers than we do. And so they have this enormous program to assist those injured soldiers in a variety of ways. But the Healing Waters program specifically is to assist them through fly fishing and fly tying. Fly fishing has often been called Zen-like. There's the repetitive motion of the cast. There's, if you get into, anybody here fly fishing? Yeah, a couple, yeah. If you get into it, it becomes Zen-like. It's almost hypnotic. And it's in beautiful surroundings, and it's usually solitary, very therapeutic. And that's been recognized by the Healing Waters program in the States, and we have adopted the Healing Waters program for our Trout Unlimited Niagara chapter, and use it to kind of get them started, get these injured soldiers started in fly fishing, and in the hopes that it will speak to them and that they can use it as therapy for the rest of their lives. 3 days, we meet them for 3 days, sort of a 3-day retreat. I put comradeship first, and interestingly enough, that may be the most important thing that this brings to the program. The fly fishing's great, the fly tying, fine motor skills, tying these little flies and all that, that's great. But when we get feedback from the soldiers, the thing they talk about most is meeting people who were not judgmental, who were not part of the military, A1, number one. Several of them have said, you are the first people I have talked to since my injury who were not in a uniform. One said it was the first time he'd been out of his house since his injury. So it's the comradeship and the the completely open atmosphere. We don't question them. We don't ask them about anything. We just want to teach them to fish. And these are pictures from a couple of the years that we've done it. If you can find a face that isn't smiling. This was last year, our first year of rain, and it didn't make any difference. We couldn't get them off the pond, even though it was pouring rain. This lady's interesting. She's from Coketown, which is quite a ways from Niagara, but she found out about the Healing Waters program and said, I tie flies. Do you need flies? We said, well, yeah, sure. How much do they cost? And she said, oh, no, I love tying flies, and I've got so many flies, I just want to give them to you. She doesn't even fish. She just ties flies. And she gave us hundreds of flies that the soldiers used in the 3-day program, and she's going to do the same thing again. She goes down to Florida and ties flies all day. Other projects, we built a spawning bed on one of the little upper parts of the 12 Mile Creek for fish to use. It's a more complicated thing than it looks. You don't just throw gravel down. You need to have the gravel over upwellings because the fish will spawn only where there is cold water entering the stream, cold water upwellings. So we channeled from a swamp back here. We found upwellings of cold water and brought pipes, piped it down, put it under the stream, and then put the gravel on top so that the fish will. It's an artificial thing, but they don't know that. And here, electrofishing, we're checking to see what is in the stream. So we have a benchmark and know if we've been successful in reintroducing brook trout to a section of the stream. More recently, Megan has worked with the University of Guelph, and we no longer have to do this. Now, what this does, this is a battery pack, and it actually shocks the fish. So you take this thing now, it looks like a minesweeper, and you run it through the water, and it shocks the fish, and of course they're stunned, and they come up to the surface where they're netted, measured, and put back in, and it supposedly doesn't do them any harm. Now we've got a much better system, and we can actually just take a sample of the water, and they do genetic sampling. And they can tell what's been living in that water. They can tell if there's a brook trout or a rainbow trout or whatever. They developed this actually for that Asian carp that's coming into the Great Lakes. So they can take a sample of Lake Michigan and say, yep, they're here. They look for the genetic material, the genetic footprint of that fish. So we're able to do that. This device here that we're building is called a lunker, and we were helping the NPCA with this one, so it was more their job than ours, but we assisted. A lunker is another way of combating erosion. You can see the erosion back here. You sink tree trunks into the creek, and then put rocks over top of them, and then fill it in so that it creates an undercut bank, stabilizes the bank, and creates fish habitat. I'd like to talk just for a second about some of the partnerships that we have developed over the years. Niagara College has been very important to us. The college's ecosystem restoration program and geographic information systems program have provided us with the science to go to granting agencies or to go to permitting agencies and say, hey, look, we know what we're talking about. We've got the information here. We've got the science here. Both of those programs are postgraduate programs, so most of the people who come into them already have BAs or BScs or even MAs in some cases or MScs in some cases. So this is a year of add-on to their university degree and outfits them to be into the ecosystem restoration or geographic information systems environment. So they present us at the end of their term. We become their clients. And they present us at the end of the term with a document that is sometimes 100 pages long that examines a specific stretch of the creek. So we know everything about that little stretch of the creek. And over the 8 years we've been doing this, stretch by stretch by stretch, we've been forming a picture of the creek that is incomparable. And so the Niagara College Ecosystem Restoration Program and Geographic Information Systems programs have been very, very good to us. Geographic Information Systems program used to, up until 2 years ago, go on the ground and slog through the creek and take measurements and draw maps and all that. Now they use drones. Just put them up, and the software you wouldn't believe. It presents a complete picture of the stretch of creek that they're interested in. The Niagara Restoration Council is a small organization that we work very extensively with, and they've been very helpful in working with us. The Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, now reinvented, and they have brought their restoration program back, and we'll be working with them quite seriously over the next little while. How can you help? Well, you could join TUC. Megan's got application forms. It's $40 a year, and it's tax deductible, and that contributes to the preservation of cold water systems across Canada, but more specifically, half of the money goes back to us. You could volunteer with us. You could come out and work on clay cliffs and whatnot. But there are other local chapters that you could also volunteer with. There are several local chapters around here. The Greg Clark chapter works on the Credit River, and the Ted Knott chapter on Bronte Creek. And they've done fantastic work on Bronte Creek. If you've been up to Lowville, you've seen there's $1 million that TUC put into that stretch of Bronte Creek. So all of that's good stuff. And you could continue to lobby governments to restrict developments in the headwaters, protect wetlands and streams. We are working on an agreement with the town of Pelham, which is the municipality that's in the headwaters of 12 Mile Creek. We're working on an agreement with them that sort of an umbrella motherhood statement that says in all of your procedures, practices, and programs, you will consider the health of 12 Mile Creek first. And if they sign that, I mean, it's words on paper, but let's hope that before they do anything, they'll say, oh yeah, okay, well, I wonder if this is going to affect 12 Mile Creek. And most importantly, you can continue to protect the headwaters by hanging on to that absolutely gorgeous and extremely valuable piece of land. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thanks, Brian. Any questions? Yes.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about the anglers at the beginning, do you have an appreciation for what portion would practice catch and release?
Sorry, what part is catch and release?
Well, when you're talking about half of your members are anglers, and I'm just wondering how many practice catch and release?
Every one of them claims to. I hope that they do. I was talking to this gentleman here a little while ago about that exact thing. His son fishes and practices catch and release. I can't remember the last fish I killed. It's so long ago. And I sincerely hope that all of our members practice catch and release. And I think that they do. I don't begrudge people taking the occasional walleye from Lake Ontario. They're plentiful, and the government puts a limit on how many can be taken. It's a pretty generous limit. Boy, that's a heck of a lake. But in terms of trout, and interestingly, 12 Mile Creek, yes, it has trout in it. Yes, they're on your property. I doubt very much that it's ever going to be a viable fishery. I think if we can return it to health, it will be a wonderful resource. The presence of the trout will tell us that it's a good, healthy, cold water stream, but let's not mess with them. Whatever you think about catch and release, and some people have got a lot of concerns about catch and release, it's better than catch and fillet.
You have the brook trout, which are the penultimate indicated species. Do you have other levels if you cannot achieve that, that perfection in cold water streams, where at least it's viable for other species?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a whole hierarchy of species that will tell us that the stream is in good shape. Probably at the top of that list is the American eel. And we did discover in the electrofishing, we did find one American eel. And the people who found it were absolutely over the moon, because that kicks in all kinds of designations of endangered species. And the government will come in, and funders will come in and try, and we found only one, but it was a good indicator that the American eel still lives in there. But to answer your question more directly, brook trout are number one, brown trout, rainbow trout. Rainbow trout can survive what brook trout cannot. Brown trout can survive what brook trout cannot. And there is some evidence that brook trout and brown trout can live in the same environment. There is also very good evidence that rainbow trout will eat both of the others. So if we have a hierarchy, it's brookies and then browns, and we would prefer not to have the rainbows there. Interestingly enough, you know, one man's meat is another man's poison. Here, we seek so hard to preserve our remaining brook trout. In Alberta and British Columbia, they're an invasive species, and they're actively killing them. Because their native species is rainbow trout and cutthroats and bull trout. And somebody took brook trout out there and put them in, and they've thrived. And they want them out because they're not native. So they can give them to us. We take them. Yeah.
Once a creek loses its fish, is it possible to restock it? Because I know they have to go back where they were born to respawn.
Yeah. The question is, once a creek loses its fish, can it be restocked? And the answer is yes. If we can get stretches of the stream sufficiently rehabilitated to support brook trout, and we'd have to prove that. But if we could do that, then we could restock. But, and this is the second part of your question, but the ministry is very, very, very cautious about what you stock back in there. You can't just take any old brook trout. You want the brook trout that has the genetic imprint of 12 Mile Creek brook trout. Now, we know where there are still some brook trout, and your property is one of the spots. And what we would have to do, if we did rehabilitate a stretch, what we would have to do is capture brook trout from the Short Hills Sanctuary, cause them to reproduce in a lab, and then take those fish and put them into the new part of the stream. The ministry feels that each stream has a unique genetic character. So we can't just take fish from the Credit River and dump them into 12 Mile Creek, much as we would love to, because there's lots up in the headwaters of the Credit. So it's a tricky question, but that's the answer. Yeah. We can do it. Now, if all of the fish, all of the brook trout in the 12 Mile Creek are extirpated, are gone, what happens then? Well, if we have rehabilitated the stream sufficiently, I suppose they'd let us put a different type of brook trout in, but you'd have to ask the ministry. Yeah.
Are there any red side case or mud puppies in there?
Yes. Yeah. We have found both. There are quite a number of small, these are little minnows. We found quite a number of small species in there. Whether they're providing food for fish, for the larger predator fish, I don't know. I assume so, yeah. There are also white suckers in there that also provide some food for the trout.
Any more work being done on cooling the stream?
Yes, a lot of our efforts are spent on various ways of cooling the stream. All the riparian plantings, all of the plantings along the edge of the stream are intended first to stabilize the banks with the root system, but secondly to shade the stream from the sun. And that's very, very important. And anytime the sun gets at a stream, you see an overhang, trees and all that kind of thing, makes it devilish hard to fish, but boy, is it ever good for the stream to have all of those trees hanging over it and protecting it from the sun. The whole question of reforesting has come up in our discussions, and the next phase of our project, our Healthy 12 Mile Creek project, will include a lot of money and effort set aside for just reforestation of the headwaters to provide not just the shade, but the transpiration effect, the evapotranspiration, the evaporation and transpiration, which also cools a system. I don't know if how many have been to the Short Hills Sanctuary and kind of walked through it? Yeah. As you walk through there and you see the 12 Mile Creek coming through under the culvert on Mettler Road, and then it wanders through the sanctuary, there's another stream that we have only just discovered. Two of the GIS people found it. Another little stream that originates right on Center Street. There's a big cliff on Center Street, and the water comes bubbling up out of the ground right at Center Street at 11 degrees. I mean, we measured it, and it's a really significant stream. And it comes rushing in and joins the main branch coming in from Mettler. And the interesting thing is, the main branch coming in from Mettler is coming from those three ponds, right? We cooled the stream, but we didn't cool them as much as we'd hoped, as I said. So they're too warm for brook trout. But once that other stream comes in from Center Street, from there on is brook trout heaven. That stream cools the entire system sufficiently that brook trout can thrive in it. And of course, they can thrive all the way up to that little source on Center Street. So that's another really important area of that cooling effect of the stream. Anything else, Jim?
I noticed in your presentation, your pictures, all your repairs, the material you're using are logs and things that eventually will decay and have a limited time span. When you repair that, you have to go back and do it again. Why not use hard materials like, for instance, a big rock would work the stream and cause the bubbling and erosion?
Yeah. The question is a good one. I mean, why do we use wood, which will eventually rot, instead of using rocks to do all that? One is that we don't have the rocks, and they're very, very, very expensive, extremely expensive, and the wood is so much easier to manipulate into place. The other thing is that we have made sure that we have put lots of plantings in wherever we've put the logs, so that when the logs eventually, 60, 80, 100 years, when the logs eventually are rotten, that structure will still be there, that the roots will have taken hold, and either the meander or the bank will hold. Rock would be superior, for sure, but extremely expensive and difficult to find. The temperature of the water coming in under Mettler, depending on the season, it all depends on the season, but on the hottest days of summer, in July, August, it was pushing 30 degrees. The problem is that the ponds, our estimate of what we were able to do with the ponds was somewhat faulty because they weren't as deep as we thought. If they had been, say, 3 meters deep instead of 2, then that water would have been much cooler. But the water that we're getting is just not cool enough. Now, that said, we have seen brook trout come up there in the cooler months, in fall and spring. They'll come up there. But in the summer, they can't live there. And that's where they have to go down to that confluence of the cold stream coming in from Center Street. And that's where they live in the hot time. So they have that refuge to get to. I think that's it. Oh.
Yeah, there's a growing concern about the effect of road salt on the health of water in lakes. Have we been monitoring that in the creek at all?
Yeah, it is a real problem. And that was the first thing that we approached the town of Pelham about. Because, and it's an education thing. I mean, the guys, the road crew, they don't know that that's 12 Mile Creek. It's a ditch. So you dump your snow in there. They were for years, they were dumping it right into the headwaters in Font Hill. If you know Font Hill at all, there's a little park there called Marlene Stewart Street Park. And that's where the headwaters are. That's the water gushes out of the ground there. It's what gives Font Hill its name. It's the font that gives Font Hill its name. That water gushing out of the ground, right in Marlene Stewart Street Park, right in downtown Font Hill. And for years, the town was taking the snow off Highway 20 and on the other surrounding streets and dumping it so that it flowed straight down into those fonts. They've stopped, and we're continually in talks with them. There's another area right on Metler, right beside your sanctuary, where they have actually dug a nice little channel so that the melt-off will run down and into the creek. And and that's just ignorance. They just didn't know what they were doing, and so we have to educate. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure.